And the title is still a little bit in flux, so I think in the program it says something different, but really I think we are settling on identification of quantity-quality trade-off with imperfect fertility control. And so the motivation is that there are family planning policies, pronatalist policies, a variety of policies in different countries that we would like to know the consequences of. And so we say, well, we need an estimate of the quantity-quality trade-off because we need to evaluate these policies. So when you need an estimate, then you're going to say, well, we need some sort of exogenous variation in fertility that's going to allow us to estimate this quantity-quality trade-off credibly. And what we're going to be talking about in this paper is that really there are two types of exogenous variation that we can think of, and these have not been sufficiently recognized in the literature, we think. One is exogenous variation in planned fertility, and another one is exogenous variation in unplanned fertility. So what we're trying to do is to distinguish the causal effect, two different causal effects, potentially different, of increases in family size on child outcomes, the standard question we usually associate with the quantity-quality trade-off. So that's the goal. There are many challenges. One is that we need to integrate a variety of pieces of theory. Another one is that the data is not very abundant to do what we want to do, although we will be able to do it. But it's just in a particular case we have access to a particular piece of data. And obviously we need to deal with selection bias. That's an old problem. But here it's going to be even more complicated because there's going to be multiple types of selection bias. So what are we going to do? The contributions is to formulate a dynamic model of quantity-quality trade-off with three features that you don't see often together: sequential fertility, imperfect fertility control, and a dynamic multi-stage technology of skill formation. We're going to develop an empirical strategy to distinguish these planned and unplanned effects of increases in family size. We are going to use some new developments in the study of causality, a very general causal framework to try to bound some of the treatment effects we are going to be looking at. And finally, we are going to be testing for the presence of some sort of bias in the standard sort of approach you see often, which is just to grab some sort of IB and go ahead and estimate some kind of effect of family size instrumenting with some instrument. So, quantity quality is very important. One of the most important topics in social sciences. It's very key to understanding these policies that we want to, get a handle on in countries that are trying to either increase or reduce family size. It has a lot of implications theoretically for a lot of literature in macro, in growth, development, in models of demographic transition. So it's definitely an important issue. What we feel is that there hasn't really been an integration of some of the things that are there, and there has been too much focus on quantity quality, but in some sense this idea of unplanned births has kind of taken a back seat. If you go to a demographers conference, as I usually go, almost they don't believe that we even choose a single birth, let alone all of them. So what we're going to try to do is to try to come up and revive those early attempts to account for unplanned births. As you can see, early work by Becker and Michael Willis and Rosenzweig and Schultz. But integrate all that with the new developments by Heckman, Cunha, and co-authors on the dynamics of skill formation. We're going to say, well, what is quality? Well, quality eventually is the skills. And the skills we learned in the last decade are not produced in a static single-shot decision, but it's a complicated dynamic process. On the other hand, all that literature on the dynamics of the technology of skill formation really hasn't really integrated all the stuff about fertility that we know from the quantity quality. So what we're going to try to do is really to combine Becker-Lewis with Heckman, Cunha, and allow for unplanned births along the way. So why do we think we need new data? Well, because the problem is usually when we test these effects of family size, we just take the number of kids, but we don't know whether those kids were planned or not. So in a few instances, you can actually have access to reports of pregnancy intention which you usually don't have, okay? Usually when you have access to administrative data, survey or census data, which is the way people have tested the quantity-quality trade-off, really you don't have the luxury of knowing whether each and every kid...
Maybe pedantic, but you can have planned pregnancy, the birth would be planned, because there's an option for abortion, right?
Yes, so you can always abort, but if...
Do you allow for that?
We are not going to model abortion, but it's going to be taken into account. It's not in the model, but at the end of the day, in the general framework, it's going to be, because we're going to allow for general patterns of unobservables, multidimensional. So you can imagine the willingness of a family to abort or not is going to be one of the unobservables in the model. So we will get to that. I'll comment on the abortion option a little bit later on.
Every birth is planned, it is just different costs of birth control in some sense.
Yes, yes, exactly. So yes.
When you talk about unplanned birth, is it about the life cycle stuff, that in the end you will have too many kids compared to your desired fertility? Or is it about the timing? Because those are two different things.
Correct. It's going to be births in excess of your desired fertility. So a birth that happens a little bit too early maybe, but you were planning to have anyways, we're going to count it as planned, okay? We could, okay? Yeah. So another thing we're going to do then is we're going to say, well, once we allow for these two different effects, you can either have a causal effect of an increase in family size that's planned and another one that's unplanned. What do we do if we have a single instrument? Obviously, we're going to run into problems because we are not going to be able to identify with a single instrument the two types of treatment. You can say a treatment that is a planned third child or an unplanned third child. And so what we're going to say is, well, point identification is not going to be feasible, but we are going to be able to derive some bounds. And those bounds alone are going to allow us to say something interesting relative to what is usually done in the literature. So let me start very quickly with the static model. In the static model, this follows Magne Mostad and Matt Wiswell's formulation of the quantity-quality static model. So parents derive utility from quantity and quality and their own consumption, okay? And you can combine the utility from children into this sub-utility function, little u, that depends on quantity and quality. Okay, and sigma is the key parameter characterizing the elasticity of substitution between q and n. So what is child quality? Well, we're going to be assuming that to link it to this literature and skill formation, we're going to say, well, parents care about the eventual final level of skill that this kid have. So parents care about skills. So we have a static technology of skill formation that transforms investment I into quality Q. Okay, and parents have standard resource constraint. This is the famous multiplicative term here in the resource constraint that says that, you know, whatever you invest in a kid, you need to multiply by the number of kids, and then that plus your consumption is going to be your total endowment. Yes?
So you don't believe in any economies of scale?
Economies of scale?
In investing in kids. So you have a good home environment, there are going to be a lot, big spillovers.
Right.
So, okay, perhaps food is exclusive, but many are, and time, you know, but how you spend your even time has economies of scale. And so that might give a very stark contrast between quality and quantity if you just assume that it's multiplicative.
Fair enough. Fair enough. This is, I'm just taking this off the shelf. I mean, it's just the closest model, I would say, to just emphasizing the discreteness of the problem. But yeah, it's very much the old model where things enter multiplicatively and there is no economies of scale. That's actually a point that we're going to come back later. In terms of the combination of technologies, when you have to deal with multiple kids at the same time, invest at the same time, you know, there might be technologies that are better combined with others, and that may have to...
I mean, you're right, if it's to do with schooling.
Right.
Of course, that's, you know, and you have to pay for fees and that kind of thing. But like buying schooling, yes, that is like I times N.
Well, no, well, in the US,
But it might be more, there may be more spillover.
in the US, you may pay a fixed cost of living in a place where it has good school.
Even there, yes.
So there, with higher end, actually, even there you have economies. But in any event, so this is the optimal, the first order condition of this problem that says, each additional unit of resources, you're going to spend it, to equate the marginal utility of parental consumption to the marginal productivity in terms of enhanced quality for your kids.
Well, just one question. You're not focusing on the developing countries where mortality could be accepted?
No, there is no mortality here, but yeah, that's definitely a more important issue for developing. We are going to test this with US data, so mortality is less of an issue, but no. So what is the quantity-quality trade-off? Well, remember, you can actually choose for every possible n an optimal investment and therefore get an optimal quality. So you can actually, unlike the standard formulation that treats n as continuous, you can treat n as discrete and find out what's the optimal Q for each possible n for any sequence of n, assuming no childlessness. Okay? So the QQ trade-off is essentially a locus on NQ that gives you the optimal Q. If the family knew in advance and with certainty each of these possible quantities n that they are going to have over their lifetime. And that's the key of the static model, right? It's a single-shot model. So in particular, the trade-off is going to give you, for example, the effect of an increase in size from 2 to 3 is going to be a slope on the quantity-quality trade-offs from 2 to 3. Okay? Now, we're going to be using completed years of schooling. There is a whole literature discussing what's the appropriate measure of quality. We are going to just follow the literature and use Y, which is going to be a measure of completed years of schooling, which is imperfect, but it's what most people do. So we're going to recast then this in a treatment effects framework. Q and N are both choices, but conditional on N, you can then say, well, I can define a treatment based on N and say, well, the resulting quality Y is a potential outcome. So I can define a treatment T, and I can say, well, a treatment TC is to have a child. We're going to assume everybody has 2. We're going to be focusing on the parity 2 and parity 3 of the quantity-quality trade-off. So we can say, well, to have a child is really to move from 2 to 3. To have no child is to stay at 2. And that defines a treatment, okay? And so then the quantity-quality trade-off is just going to be, it's just going to give you the slope of that curve between 2 and 3. Okay, and it's going to give you the effect of having a child versus not having it on Y. For a family omega, then beta omega is going to be that causal effect. Now, this is for a single family, but of course, families are different, so beta omega can be different for different families. So at the end of the day, what we would like to know is the average treatment effect that averages across families. And if families were randomly assigned to different fertility sizes, family sizes, then we could just take the simple mean. But of course, that's not what happens. And essentially, we need to account for selection. Why? Because families who take treatment, TC, meaning they go on to have a child, are going to be unobservably different from those who don't. And here is an example. I'm using different nus, which, as you might remember here, is the parameter on the Cobb-Douglas that aggregates utility from children and parental consumption. So the higher the nu, the more sort of altruistic the parent is, or the more derives utility from children. So if we change the nus, we can see that for a low nu, this is the quantity-quality trade-offs. As we move the n, how much the quality goes down, and here the same for families with high nu. And here you can see the maximal utility, meaning what's the optimized utility that the family is going to reach at each of these parities, okay? So right here you can see the selection problem, okay? Let me zero in into parities 2 and 3 so you can see it clearly. Here is the slope of the quantity-quality trade-off from 2 to 3 for the 2 types of families. But we said that families who are red are going to be optimizing here at 3. That's where it peaks their maximal utility. Almost, it's very close to 4. It's very close, but it's really 3. And black families is 2. So really, red families are going to be having 3 kids and provide them this level of utility. Black families are going to having 2 kids and provide this level of utility. So obviously what you get is the wrong QQ trade-off, okay? And what's happening here is you have huge selection by having parents who like so much the utility from kids that have a lot of kids and invest a lot of quality on them. So you end up having an upward sloping quantity-quality trade-off that is what no one in principle would expect.
This example illustrates the problem of just using final schooling as the outcome. Because we know that the quality of schooling is massively disparate. And we know there's also quite a lot of racial segregation, which ends up meaning that black families have really bad qualities, access to really bad schools. So,
no, good point.
Yeah.
We haven't thought about that, but definitely this would be a better thing to do in a place where it has much more homogeneous schooling system like Norway. A lot of the things we are going to be talking about is some of the testing has been done mostly by Sandy Black and other papers that really is not really in the US, but there are some papers in the US, and I agree. In that case, the schooling, one would need to control for quality to really compare apples and apples. Yeah.
So in addition to the selection problem that you described, isn't there also a dynamic aspect to this? So you're comparing people who are not planning to have a third with people who maybe accidentally have a third, and if people are, dynamically optimizing, they're already invested differently in their first couple of kids.
Yeah, that's all what the paper is about. So let me get to that in a second. Right, I just started to tell you what the basic static model is and how things change once we have the. So what do people do? Because they have this model in mind, actually. That's why I spent some time going through it. The common experience strategy is essentially to go and essentially get an instrument C omega that's going to change an exogenous change in n, the size of the family, but is otherwise unrelated to the quality of the kid. Okay? And two of the most common instruments that people use in the literature are the twins instrument that has a lot of literature, growing literature that uses this instrument, starting with Rosenzweig and Volpin, and the same-sex instrument, which is the one actually I'm going to talk about today. Because we have data on this, we don't have data on this. Okay? So these two instruments people use, these instruments were originally developed in the literature on the effect of fertility on labor supply, but they have subsequently been applied to the question of, the effect of family size on child outcomes. So there has been, a ton of work on the validity of these instruments. There are some potential problems on non-randomness of child sex at conception, hand-me-down cost savings, direct effects on child outcomes. But people have tried and have done some, you can never test this, but have done things to check the consistency of the validity of the instrument, and it seems to survive most of the tests. So since people keep using it, we thought it's a good idea to kind of take a look. So we are not going to relitigate all these issues. I'm sure many of you, if not all, already seen this. So we're going to take the instrument as valid, and we're going to come up with another point, which is the issue of how you're measuring these treatments. You're combining two distinct treatments into a single treatment by just taking family size equal 3 as the same thing, without distinguishing whether that third kid was planned or not. So how do you actually put the same-sex instrument into a model? Well, you can follow Rosenzweig and Volpin that define this fraction of girls, okay, little r, and then they just put it into the utility function, okay? Of course, again, ignoring the effect through the budget constraint and the hand-me-down cost savings, this is just put there an effect that says if you have an imbalance, something that goes away from 0.5, you're going to suffer some disutility, okay? Now, we point out, this I don't think I've seen it, but we point out it's not a big issue, but let me point out that, similar to the points that Rosenzweig and Volpin made about female labor supply, here you also need a separability condition, meaning this R needs to enter the utility separately from Q, otherwise you're going to have that the instrument changes the quality of the kids, even potentially without changing fertility, which is a no-no for an instrument. So I just wanted to point that out. But then what people do is, okay, they define the same-sex instrument, which is equal to 1 if you have all kids of the same sex, and therefore your R is equal to 0 or 1, or equal to 0 when you have a mixed sex composition in your first two kids. Okay, and so once people secure this instrument, they go ahead and estimate the effect of a third child on the completed schooling levels of the first child by two-stage least square by running something like this. Okay, so you have the effect of having 3 instead of 2 on some outcome completed years of schooling, instrumenting with the same-sex instrument. Now, there is an interesting paper by Junjian Yi and Junsen Zhang, that shows that there are some, even with valid instruments, there are some specification issues here. Like, for example, you're only looking at the firstborn child and not the average. But fair enough, we are going to focus on the firstborn child and take that as as an effect of the quantity-quality trade-off. But really, is the average what you should be looking at. So beta 1 hat gives you what? Gives you a local average treatment effect. It gives you the causal effect of having a child versus not having a third child for families omegas who are compliers. Compliers are families whose fertility is induced to change from 2 to 3 when the instruments changes from 0 to 1. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to go grab our data and actually run this. So we are going to implement the standard empirical strategy because we observe measures of n and we observe measures of y and of z and some controls x. Okay, so we can actually run this and we get, I'm not going to show you tables, but essentially we get what everyone else is getting in this literature, which is they get a 0 effect or no effect once they do IB. And they say, well, there must be no quantity-quality trade-off because once I do it the right way by instrumenting, the effect disappears. But it's there in OLS.
Sorry, but in the example you showed before, like the OLS was a positive effect, and then there was kind of a more negative effect in the IB, right? Or I got it the other way. Like when you show these two graphs with the example.
Yeah, this is just an example of selection on one particular way in which selection operates, which is new. There are many others. It could compensate or not, I don't know. But yeah, that's just an illustration. I'm not trying to. So anyways, here comes the issue. All this literature, all those papers I just showed you before, whether with twins or with same-sex instrument, they really don't distinguish with whether that increase in the third kid is either planned or not. And the fact is, and I know these numbers very well, about 50% of all the pregnancies that happen every year in the US are unintended, okay? This combines mistimed, but there is still a huge share of it, about half of it is purely what you would say unwanted. These are women who say, I wasn't planning to have it at that time, and I wasn't planning anything in the future either. Yes?
This IV is valid if it's planned, right? If it's not
Exactly.
planned, right?
Exactly. That's what the paper is about. So we're gonna try to focus.
They distinguish. They make the assumption they're all planned.
Right. But the whole point is to try to understand what happens when a sizable number of your increases to 3 are not planned and are contaminating your IV, to see what you get. Yes.
Sorry, do you have the age distribution of mothers, like 50% of all pregnancies? So, this is like the mean, right?
Yeah, this is just, look, I'm going to give you a better number. Here is a better number. Because this is really overall.
Yeah.
But here is the number that I think is more interesting. Among all the families that had 2 intended kids, okay, so I can control and see that the 2 that they had first, they were intended. Among all those, and the ones who go on to have a third kid, which is a sizable number, 25% of those, the third kid was unplanned, okay? So this is telling you that of all those increases from 2 to 3, 1 out of 4 is completely unplanned.
But on that thing, if let's show that. If the instrument is switched off, in other words, you have 2 children of the same sex who's 4, you might be less likely to go for an abortion than if the instrument is switched off. So it's not true that the instrument will not be driving unplanned births. Right? Because there is at that point, probably the first trimester is an easier decision to make. At that point, you make it as a function of instrument.
That's a good point, and we're gonna talk about that point later on if I have time.
What do you do for income? Because the higher income levels, the unplanned pregnancies drop a lot.
Yeah.
Plus, the women are less likely to have abortion. At lower income levels, unplanned pregnancies are much higher, and the women are also much more likely to have an abortion. So I would say at the lower income levels, those kids are never going to go to school. And the cost of having another kid is like zero, whether it's planned or unplanned.
You can control for income, but formally, if this instrument is good enough, you can just not even control for it, and you will get the right result. So in any event, what happens is in the static model, these unintended births are not very interesting. Why? Because the family chooses N, then implements the Q. And with imperfect fertility control, the only thing that happens is you choose N, and before you implement the Q, someone tells you you have N plus 1. So you still go down the same curve, and therefore, in the static model, the third child, whether it's intended or not, doesn't really matter. Okay, so the only thing you need to do is you just redefine that instead of having TC and TNO, you have now 3 possible treatments, or 2 treatments and one essentially control, which is not to have another kid. But now you distinguish between having a planned third kid or an unplanned third kid. Okay, so the idea then is that the quantity-quality trade-off now between parities 2 and 3 is going to be different depending on whether you have a planned or an unplanned kid, and whether you're essentially computing the effect of a planned increase against having no additional child, or an unplanned increase against no additional child. Okay, and so since the outcome at the end of the day is the same, the treatment effects are the same, and people sort of don't bother about this. Now, what happens when we go into the dynamics? And as I said before, we're going to develop a model that embeds unplanned births with sequential dynamic fertility and this dynamic process of technology of skill formation. So the key feature is going to be that the investments in the development of the intended kids that the family was already thought they had and they were done with, they're going to start investing on those kids, and in the middle of that process is that the unplanned kid is going to come up, and it's going to generate a whole set of disarrays. Okay, not only is going to generate some disruption, but families who already know that they're going to have, as Wilbur was saying, they already know that they are going to have another kid. They may change their initial investments even before that kid comes up and do things differently. So I'm going to assume a lot of things that are very relevant, but they are not going to help me highlight the 2 points that I want to make. So I'm going to assume away a lot of things, like you just can have either 1 or 2. The empirical part is going to be between 2 and 3, but really here it's going to be too complicated, so I do 1 and 2. No spacing, no timing, no uncertainty, no heterogeneity in initial endowments, no borrowing savings, no bequest, and parents are going to always try to get the same quality for both kids. Okay. Now, what does this model do? So essentially, it has 2 stages of sequential investment that eventually produce Q, and the family begins implementing the investment on the firstborn child before reaching the target quantity when it's 2. Okay, if the target is 2, they start investing on the first kid even before the second comes in, which seems like what happens in reality, right? So the unintended birth risk is going to be resolved after an star has been chosen, okay, and after the initial investment on the firstborn has been implemented. Okay, so families who intentionally choose to have a second child face no uncertainty and go through the smooth path of optimal investment over time deterministically, but families who choose not to have a kid are going to face a risk and are going to eventually perhaps have a second child in an unintended fashion. Okay? So what happens? In response to an unintended child that shows up, there's going to be several margins for parents to adjust. They can lower their own consumption. They can lower the investment in the existing kids, or relative to what it would have happened if there was no unintended kid. Or they can lower the investment in the unintended child relative to what would have happened if that child was fully foreseeable and planned. Okay? So let me give you a quick overview of what the model looks like. We are going to again focus on at least one and at most 2 children. There's going to be a parental investment in child N at development stage T. Okay, and so you're going to decide whether to have a planned second child. We're going to denote by B intended. And the initial skill endowment is going to be the same and fixed and known for all kids, theta. Okay, theta 1. So there's going to be 4 periods in the model, tau, and tau is going to be different from t. Tau is going to really index the life cycle of the parent, and t is going to just index the development stage of the kid. Okay. So how's quality produced in this model? Well, we're going to use this sort of Heckman-style production technology where we are going to have that skill is produced next period, theta n t plus 1, with skill today, and with my investments as a parent today. Okay? And we're going to use standard assumptions, and we're going to highlight the fact that there are multiple stages. So the technology is not the same in the initial development stage. It's certainly different than in the second stage of development, t equal 2. So we use standard assumptions. And in addition, if you add self-productivity and static complementarity between skills and investment, what we get is dynamic complementarity, which is the famous result in Heckman and Cunha and Heckman, sorry. So you get dynamic complementarity, which says that the returns to investment in the second stage of development are higher the higher the investments were in the first period, and the other way around. Okay? So the idea is that the technology is sort of Leontief in the second period. This is going to have a huge impact because parents foresee that when they get to the second stage, they better be prepared to back up those initial investments. Otherwise, everything is going to be lost. Yeah.
If I want to think about the time, because I seem to remember what Cunha and Ekman find is that there is substitution during the first period and then complementarity.
Exactly.
So if we're talking about 5 years apart, yeah, but you know what? How many years is this?
Well, it's not going to be a structural model. So this is just to get the mechanism, just to get an idea.
In your data, I mean, if the two kids are just 1 year apart from each other, it's not the same as the 3 years.
Absolutely. But we are just going to use data on completed years of schooling and same-sex instrument and use a general framework. And the only addition we're giving is that we have information on whether the increase in family size was planned or not. So all this is just to illustrate. I mean, of course, if you can do a full structural model year by year, this, you know, and put the entire dynamics of skill formation there, that's very interesting.
So this could be, if I understand, it's going to be a structural model, right?
No, it won't. It will not.
Oh, it will not.
Yeah. It's just a model to illustrate the mechanism why the causal effect of an unplanned kid is different from the causal effect of a planned kid. It's just to show you. I'm going to try to hurry up, so let me show you why I think so. So bottom line is, now you have constraints that hold in every period of the parent's life, okay? And now the investments are the sum across all possible investments that the parents may be doing in any kid that's, you know, is available for investment at that particular period, okay? And the timeline is in the first period, the first child is born. Parents decide whether they're going to have another child in the future, and then they choose the investment on that first kid. Okay. Moreover, they pre-select a technology to be used in the second stage of development for that kid, and that's going to be a key because that technology is actually going to be kind of exposed inefficient whenever they select it, thinking they are not going to have any more kids, and then they end up having one. So in the second period, that happens. Parents, you know, that chose to have another kid. I'm sorry, this is wrong. So among parents who chose not to have another kid, 1 minus pi of them successfully avoids an unplanned birth. So we set BU equals 0. And pi of them ends up with an unplanned kid. And so we use little b to denote whether there was any additional kid or not, whether intended or unintended. Okay? And so parents are going to then choose the level of investment on the first kid in his second stage of development, and also the level of investment in the second kid, if there is one there, in his first level of. So the second period is the critical one because there you get the overlapping. Again, the assumptions of the duration of the period, you know, it's difficult to put some clear numbers there, but as Pierre-André was saying. So third period, the new skill levels of the existing children are observed. They are deterministic, but they are realized. And then the second child is, if there is a second child present, then you need to finish up with him, essentially doing the second investment on the second kid. In the fourth period, all the final skills are done, which is theta 3 for every kid. And then the parents just sit back and enjoy the quality of the kids. Okay, so the timing is, again, 4 periods. Here you invest on the first kid. In the second period, you check whether there is any birth, either when you plan it or not. And then whatever kids are there, you invest on them. Then you invest on the second kid if there is one. and eventually finish up at the last period. So the terminal quality essentially is theta 3. It's the skill level 3 stages into the future. And it obviously depends on what? On the initial skill level theta 1 and on the 2 investments I1 and I2 that the parent made on that kid. And it's a function of all the other parameters of this technology. By the way, did I introduce the technology? Yeah. No, but I didn't do the CES example, did I? Which? Okay, sorry. I think I lost the CES example here. Okay, never mind. So bottom line is this technology of skill formation I had shown you here. You can, for example, assume a CES that gives you all ranges of complementarities and substitutabilities between theta and I. And if you assume that, this is going to be the final level of quality theta 3 that you get, where all these gammas and deltas and phis and rhos are CES of the 2. Each one is indexed by 1 or 2 because they are either the first stage or the second stage parameter technologies. Okay, yes?
In the dynamics, do you take into account the quality of the match between the parents and the machine makes the child alone?
No. The quality of the match between the parents is fixed. No, that's another assumption we are making, but definitely these things can evolve and.
Because I'm curious about giving children different technologies bad and you want to select it.
No, absolutely. So again, we are making a lot of simplifications just to show that in a dynamic model there are going to be 2 key mechanisms that are going to lead to the causal effect of an unplanned increase in family size be different from the one of a planned one. Okay, so this is the dynamic optimization problem. Yeah.
Just to follow up on the earlier point, I think in terms of your empirical application, it's going to be important that in your model, these are beliefs that people have at the time they make these decisions, right? So expose some kid might be planned or unplanned, that it might be different from at the time of the decision. So it could be learning, you could have your first kid, at that point you might not have expected to have another kid. That changes over time. So there is, right, in terms of eventual interpretation of what your treatment effect, that composition is important. So is that stable? What's planned and unplanned, is that stable?
Yeah, we are assuming, again, this is a very simple model in which things don't change for you regarding how much fertility do you want. So you kind of already know at the beginning how much you want. And it only depends, the only thing can make you change your mind is that same-sex instrument. And so, yeah, but a more richer model, things change over your life and, you well, yeah, but they are asked, at the time you were conceived this kid, were you planning to have any kids at that point or into the future? So essentially it gives you that broad idea of whether you're planning or not. Of course, integrating over all the uncertainty that can unravel over your next of your life. So here is the other issue. These guys then do these dynamic optimization problems, but they face this technology adoption problem, which is in the second stage, they need to choose what technology they're going to use to keep up investing on the first kid, right? So, at the beginning, they need to commit to this technology. And, when the parents plan to have another child, they surely select a technology where, it's not very heavy on inputs that are going to be scarce. If they know there's going to be 2 kids overlapping next period, they're going to choose a technology that's going to be much easier to get some results out of with little investment, okay? So here you see technology B and technology A. So technology B, essentially what gives you is you can invest very little and it gives you pretty good bang for the buck. But really what parents usually want to do is to take technology A that requires a little bit more investment, a little bit more resources and so on, but can deliver a much higher product, okay? Theta 3, remember, is the final quality. So these are technologies in the second stage. So this is what you're going to do. And here comes the key. Of course, if you're planning to have a kid, then you select the blue technology. If you're planning not to have one, You know that there might be a risk. There is a 25% risk that you might get one. But then you go with the red one. What happens is the ones who go with the red one, the ones who end up having with a kid, they need to cut down a lot the investment on that kid, and they end up harming that kid. So here, this idea gives you the key mechanism by which an unplanned increase in a family size is going to end up harming more the first child in the family. Okay? On the other hand, as I mentioned before, this dynamic complementarity in the technology of skill formation is going to have the opposite effect. Okay? The effect there is going to be what? The effect is going to be that if you know that there is a strong dynamic complementarity and you know that you're going to have another kid, you start investing already very little on your firstborn because you know you're not going to be able to back that up. Dynamic complementarity requires a lot of follow-up on your investment because it has a strong complementarity in the second stage. This is very positive. And so that ends up what ends up happening is that through the dynamic complementarity, you have it's not very intuitive effect, which is kids who firstborns who have parents who already plan to have another second kid are actually going to be worse off relative to a situation in which the parents think they are not going to have one and end up having one anyway, okay? Because they get already leveraged. They get all the investment, and then the parents say, okay, well, I'm sorry, we already invested in this guy a lot, and now we're going to follow up because we have a very high theta in the second period. Okay, so we have these two key effects. And let me just summarize the consequences of this model by saying that at the end of the day, it's going to be an empirical question. The only case in which in this model, in which you will have the same potential outcome and therefore the same treatment effect would be if there is no dynamic complementarity, and all the evidence from Cunha and Hegma points to the fact that there is. But also, in addition to not having complementarity, you would have to have a fixed, unique technology for the second stage, and only in that case you would get this effect. So the bottom line is we think this is not equal, but we don't know if it's positive or negative, right? Because depending on the strength of these two effects, it could go either way. And why it's important which way it goes? Because that's going to tell you whether, at the end of the day, the quantity quality that you estimate with the standard IV is biased in one way or in the other. Okay? So let me get to that. We have a little bit running out of time. So what we're going to do is, here is where my co-author Rodrigo comes in, because really there are some new developments in causality, in the literature on causality. So what we're going to try to do is be as general as possible and try to ask a question, well, what can we identify if we don't impose any assumptions? So if we are as non-parametric, as non-separable as we can. And the bottom line is we are going to be able to say something interesting. So here is, let me skip up the latte example, because really what we're going to be doing is a generalization of the standard binary instrument, binary treatment case from Invens and Angrist. And in the standard latte case, you just eliminate the defiers, which are these guys, and that gives you identification of the compliers. Okay, you get your latte here. So in our case, we have 3 possible treatments and 2 possible instruments, okay? Because we have either no TORCID or unplanned TORCID or planned TORCID, but we still have our old-fashioned same-sex instrument. So what can we do about that? Well, we're going to show that the problem then is that you have too many response types, okay? So because when the instrument is C1, you can have any of these 3 outcomes, and when the instrument is C0, you can have any of these 3 treatments. So there are 9 response types, okay? A response type is a vector that tells me a family, what does the family do in terms of fertility when the instrument is fixed at a particular value, okay? So there are 9 cases. And the identification problem boils down to the fact that you're going to have to reduce the number of types imposing some sort of restrictions, otherwise it's unmanageable. So we impose 4 restrictions. We say that, this comes back to what Costas was talking about. So we call unplanned child independence. We say the probability that you have an unplanned birth conditional on trying not to have it, conditional on trying not to have a second birth or a third birth. The probability that you have one is independent of the same-sex instrument. And then we also make the standard restriction of preferences for variety. So
what happens if you relax that assumption? You lose identification.
Well, with this assumption, even with this assumption, we don't have identification. We are going to be able to derive some bounds. So if we relax this one, things get a little bit difficult. We're working on it, but yeah, this one is key for now. So preference for variety is the standard assumption. For sure, you're going to have a planned kid when you get, Z1 is the same sex, Z0 is mixed sex. So when you get Z1, if you have a planned pregnancy, when you get same sex, it's much more likely than you do it when you have mixed sex. Okay, so the probability that this is bigger than this is 1. And these are two kind of more standard things that are never explicitly laid out, but say that it doesn't matter whether it is boy, girl, girl, boy. At the end of the day, you got mixed sex composition. And it doesn't matter whether it is boy, boy, or girl, girl. Okay, all what matters is you got same sex. So the bottom line is you really have four values, right? You have boy, 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 girl, 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 boy, right? With those 4 values, we really have 81 types. So here are all the types that you can have. And this shows you how the different restrictions essentially cut down on the number of types. So you impose all those restrictions. For example, 3 and 4, this you already see is 2, 5, and 2. Already 9 times remain if you impose 3 and 4, which are the standard things people not even mention. But then we need to reduce more. So we impose 1 and 2. And essentially, if we impose 1 and 2, we end up with these little 5 types there. Okay, so these are the 5 types. Have a planned kid no matter what. Have an unplanned kid no matter what. Have no kid no matter what. And 2 types that respond to the instrument. Okay, type 4 and type 5. And here is the key, Luca. So people think that this is the only type, but there is this one that's going to sneak in the causal effect. So I'm running out of time, so let me just skip ahead. There is a lot of technical stuff here on the identification, but this really comes out of Rodrigo's job market paper. So this is nothing new. I'm not going to bother you with this. But the bottom line is we can identify the probability of each type. Okay, we can identify the probability of each type by doing some sort of matrix operations and linear algebra operations, and we can also identify a set of counterfactual outcome expectations. Okay, so here we go. What's identified? All the response types probabilities for the 5 types, and the counterfactual outcomes, these counterfactual outcomes. Okay, and here you can see already the problem. The counterfactual outcome for a planned pregnancy, we cannot disentangle type 4 and type 5, and therefore we cannot ask the question, what's the causal effect of a planned third kid versus having no kid for type 4, and those kind of questions. Okay, we cannot. So bottom line is we are going to have to use some bounds if we want to derive something. So here is one quick result, which I think is of interest in itself. Here is the identified distribution of types. Okay, this tells you among the population of families how many are of each kind. And you can see people are very stubborn. They are going to end up doing the same thing no matter what, in some sense. 91% of people don't respond to the instrument, and only 9% of the families actually respond to the instrument. Now you might say, well, this type 5 seems very little, so why bother? But actually what's important is the ratio between the two. And the ratio is not that small. It's actually 26%. Why that ratio is important? Here you can see the counterfactual outcomes. These are completed years of schooling. Okay, the counterfactual completed years of schooling under each possible treatment for each type. Okay. Now, what we finally do, how much do I have? 2, 1. Okay, so let me cut to the chase. So here, what we're going to do is to decompose the standard latte, okay, which is this, as you probably know by hand already. Okay, this is the standard latte, local average treatment effect, or the micro guys at least. And so what we're going to do is decompose that, because we know what the numerator and the denominator is under our structure of types, right? So we decompose the denominator and find out the denominator is the probability of type 4, And we decompose the numerator and find out that the numerator is the difference between this and this. So bottom line is the standard ladder really, you think you're getting only this, but you're getting this term as well. Okay, and the problem then is I can pass this to the left-hand side and say, well, then what's the bias? The bias is this thing. Okay, so I told you this is 0.26, so it boils down, the sign and size of this bias is going to boil down to what this number is. Now the problem is, remember, I couldn't identify y omega TP for type 5, but I could get bounds. So I'm going to be able to bound this. So we couldn't point identify this, but we could bound it. So essentially, what we are going to get is that the bias is bounded by almost 0 and 1.35. Long story short, if you're getting a 0 estimate of the quantity-quality trade-off by using the same sex instrument, you actually may be masking a true trade-off contaminated by this positive bias that comes from the unplanned kids that are in type 5. To summarize, we develop a dynamic quantity-quality model with imperfect fertility control. The dynamic model motivates why planned and unplanned increases in family size are distinct treatments. We show that the standard ladder really commingles two response type average treatment effects. And we show that the standard two-stage least square is a bias estimator for the ladder that people have in mind. We then show that the bias can be bounded and exploit the interesting data on pregnancy intention reports and find that the bias is positive and sizable, and therefore 0 family size effects may mask true negative effects contaminated with the positive bias.
You went there fast, but it seems that the cost in terms of the number of years of completed schooling of this unexpected pregnancy seems to be very high, 3-4 years. That was you had this table.
Yeah, the problem is this table is, you cannot really compare because these are potential outcomes for each possible type. So what you would really need is to compare, for example, TP for type 1 with T-no for type 1, but we don't have T-no for type 1. We have, for different types, we have different counterfactual outcomes. The closest we get, if we have TP for type 4 only, then we could compare it with T-no for type 4. And if we have TP for type 5, we could compare it with TU for type 5. But we have it commingled, so we cannot even do that. But we can do the bound, so at least we can do some sort of bounds there.
Are you only focusing on whites, and then are you focusing only on first marriages throughout like the?
We haven't. This is almost without covariance. We have some controls there, but yeah, no, we are using everyone, and.
For example, for African Americans in the U.S., 70% I think of births are from unmarried, never married.
Yeah.
I mean women. So basically, it's a very different decision when you think of fertility or wanted or unwanted, when basically most of them give birth without not even a partner, while for whites is different. And then the other thing is, I mean, I know which data set you use. Do you have the
PSID?
Okay, so in the PSID you can get, I mean, for those that are married, you can get the duration of marriage, or so when you got married, also to understand if it is a second marriage, because clearly a fertility decision, if you have just remarried, is very different from fertility decision that we have been married for 10 years and maybe we are planning our third child. I mean,
absolutely.
Because otherwise it's actually not a third child, it will be a first child with, I'm having the first child with another.
No, absolutely. We didn't do that. We should definitely do it. The only thing we did to construct the sample was to check women who already completed their fertility by 1985, which is the time where we got those retrospective reports. And then we check, well, you know, families who have 2 or 3 kids, but we didn't really check whether the women, if the kids were half siblings or those sort of things, or we didn't really separate by race. We definitely should do that.
But also at what point these 2-3 kids happen in the life cycle matters. Now, if it happens very early in the life cycle, think of the typical age earning profile, you don't have much maybe income to counteract, whereas if it happens later in life, then you have more resources to, you know.
Yes, absolutely. We can do that as well. We have the PSID, so we have a lot of data. The only problem is the data is very small, so, but we should be able to look at income and duration, and and timing of the births as well.